Okay. Today, I will be reading one chapter from How Fascism Works. The Politics of Us and Them by Jason Stanley. Today I'm reading chapter 10 because I feel like this chapter does a really good job of touching on some of the more historical points that are brought up in the previous chapters, and it's a pretty good synopsis chapter. And in honor of it being the day after the election and Mercury being in Sagittarius, I don't want to go on too many rabbit trails, so I'm going to just read from this, be structured, and not do the full Grand Adventurer loop, because this not only provides us with some history as well as some political context as to like the steps that happened, the choices that were made, that brought us here. So it's a grounding understanding, so then we can rethink about our current situation and ideally come up with creative solutions, because we'll have a larger understanding of the perspectives that were involved in creating our current reality. I say all that to say that sometimes you just gotta ask and look up stuff in order to know what to do. So, chapter 10, How Fascism Works. The title of this chapter is Arbeit macht frei. This means work makes you free in German. It was put over the concentration camps. So, think about that. Okay. In 2017, successive hurricanes of enormous strength hit the United States. In August, Hurricane Harvey devastated the city of Houston in the state of Texas. Oh, did I say state? In August, Hurricane Harvey devastated the city of Houston in the state of Texas. In September, Hurricane Maria had a considerably worse impact on the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, many of whose residents were left for months without power. This is currently happening in Cuba. Those born in Puerto Rico, like those born in Houston, are American citizens. Oh, also, sorry, you should know that this book was published in 2018. So this is in 2018. Those born in Puerto Rico, like those born in Houston, are American citizens. And yet the difference between the reaction to the hurricanes were extreme, both federally from President Trump and among many white Americans living on the mainland United States. In an October 2017 article in The Washington Post by Jenna Johnson, headlined, "Many Trump voters who got hurricane relief in Texas aren't sure Puerto Ricans should," she quotes Fred Maddox, a 75-year-old Houston resident, on the topic of whether Puerto Rico should receive the kind of federal aid that Houston did. He says, "It shouldn't be up to us, really. I don't think so. He's trying to wake them up. Do your job. Be responsible." The Maddox family did not have flood insurance, but nevertheless received $14,000 in federal aid from FEMA. The article ends with a quote about Maddox's view of President Trump's differential responses to the disaster. The quote is, "He likes having a businessman in office, especially one who's not afraid to speak the painful truth. It's time," he said, "we had someone in there to fight for us." In fascist ideology, in times of crisis and need, the state reserves support for members of the chosen nation, for us, not them. The justification is invariably because they are lazy, lack a work ethic, and cannot be trusted with state funds, and because they are criminals and seek only to live off of state largesse. In fascist politics, they can be cured of laziness and thievery by hard labor. This is why the gates of Auschwitz had emblazoned on them the slogan, Arbeit macht frei, work shall make you free. In Nazi ideology, Jews were lazy, corrupt criminals who spent their time scheming to take the money of hard-working Aryans, a job that was facilitated by the state. The 1919 guidelines of the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, DAP, the German Workers' Party, the original name of the Nazi Party, ask, who is the DAP fighting against? The answer is, against all those who create no value, who make high profits without any mental or physical work. We fight against the drones in the state. These are mostly Jews. They live a good life. They reap where they have not sown. End quote. Their remedy was to dismantle the state and replace it with the nation. Make America great again. In contrast to the state, the nation lacks mechanisms like welfare, which Hitler denounces from robbing individuals of their capacity for economic independence. The state represented the redistribution of the wealth of hard-working citizens to undeserving minorities outside the dominant ethnic or religious community who would take advantage of them. There is a large amount of social scientific work on white American support for welfare programs, a somewhat ill-defined category in point of fact. Most often, American opposition to welfare is represented as a manifestation of a commitment to individualism, of support and desire for nurturing an ethic of self-sufficiency. And yet a dominant theme emerging from research on white Americans' attitudes towards welfare is that the single largest predictor of white Americans' attitudes toward programs described as welfare is their attitude towards the judgment that Black people are lazy. As the Princeton political scientist Martin Gillens writes in his 1996 paper, Race Coding and White Opposition to Welfare, the perceptions that Blacks are lazy has a larger effect on white Americans' welfare policy preferences than does economic self-interest, beliefs about individualism, or views about the poor in general, end quote. Of course, variables such as racism, the belief that the poor are lazy, and endorsement of certain forms of individualism are not independent of one another. Many white Americans hold false beliefs about who is poor. There is widespread ignorance of the fact that the majority of those who benefit from welfare programs are white. Furthermore, as in the previous chapter, the valorization of self-sufficiency is at its core a fascist ideology and is at the core of fascist ideology. They are inextricably intermingled with hostility towards certain hated minority groups. We might distinguish between respective beliefs in the laziness of Black people and of poor people, and in the value of self-sufficiency. But in those susceptible to fascist ideology, they often come together. In fascist ideology, the ideal of hard work is weaponized against minority populations. The French neo-fascist party, Le Front National, is viciously anti-immigrant. Party representatives regularly lambast? I don't know that word. Immigrants as lazy freeloaders living off the hard work and diligence of the true French people. For example, Marine Le Pen is current head said on the 2017 presidential campaign trail that interlopers from all over the world want to transform France into a giant squat, end quote. Take a little sake sip. The hard work versus laziness dichotomy is like law-abiding versus criminal, at the heart of the fascist division between us and them. But what is most terrifying about these rhetorical divides is that it is typical of fascist movements to attempt to transform myths about them into reality through social policy. This is where it gets really interesting. We see this regularly with movements of refugees. Okay? I have recently been learning that refugees is yet another institution. Okay? Hannah Arendt, Arendt, writes, it was always a too little noted hallmark of fascist propaganda that it was not satisfied with lying, but deliberately proposed to transform its lies into reality. Thus, Das Farsa-Korps conceded several years before the outbreak of the war that people abroad did not completely believe the Nazi contention that all Jews are homeless beggars who can only subsist as parasites in the economic organisms of other nations. But foreign public opinion, they prophesied, would in a few years be given the opportunity to convince itself of this fact once the German Jews had been driven out across the border like a pack of beggars. For such a fabrication of a lying reality, no one was prepared. The essential characteristic of fascist propaganda was never its lies. For this is something more or less common to propaganda everywhere and of every time. The essential thing was that they exploited the age-old Occidental prejudice, which confuses reality with truth, and made that true, which until then could have only been stated as a lie. So before the refugee was created, no one had the image of the poor Jewish beggar who needs help. But now you create the situation in which millions of Jews are now left destitute, and now you have an image for this lie. Now you have an actual impact, a national crisis that proves this lie. Traumatized, penniless refugees coming en masse across borders requires state aid and support before entering the labor markets. They require such support to learn the language, and initially at least they need food, shelter, and job training. By subjecting members of a despised minority to brutal treatment and then sending them as refugees across borders into other countries, fascist movements can create an apparent reality underlying their claim that members of that group are lazy and dependent on state aid or petty crime. By such methods, they also export the conditions that make fascist politics effective. This is why we should be very aware of the fact that America has been involved in nearly every foreign election since the establishment of the American colony. We destabilize governments everywhere so that we can control the narrative. This author, Hannah Arendt, Arendt, points is that fascist unreality is a promissory note on the way to a future reality that transforms into fact at least some basis of once was a stereotyped myth. Fascist unreality is, as Arendt explains, a prelude to fascist policy. Fascist politics and fascist policy cannot easily be divorced from each other. The strong temptation for those who employ fascist politics, once they assume power, is to use their position of power to make their once fantastical statements increasingly more plausible. In this way, as a prelude to ethnic cleansing or genocide, governments will artificially create the conditions inside the state that seem to legitimize the subsequent brutal treatment of the population. A good example of that is the Slavic state, led by Josef Tiso, that emerged after Nazi Germany invaded Czechoslovakia in 1939. In his 2015 book, Black Earth, The Holocaust as History and Warning, the Yale historian Timothy Snyder writes, during the transition from Czechoslovak to Slavic law, Slavics and others stole with enthusiasm from the Jews. Tiso and the leaders of the new state saw this as part of a natural process, whereby Slavics would displace Jews, and in some measure the Slavic Catholics would displace the Slavic Protestants as the middle class. Laws expropriating Jews thus created an artificial Jewish question: what to do with all of these impoverished people? Snyder subsequently explains that the solution Slavic leaders chose was to deport their Jewish population to Auschwitz, after first seeking assurances from the Nazi leader Heinrich Himmler that the 58,000 Slovakian Jews they sent would not be returned. The 2017 Rohingya crisis of ethnic cleansing and mass murder also did not occur out of the blue. As written earlier, it began in earnest in 2012, after the rape and murder of one Buddhist woman by several Rohingyan men, after which many Rohingyans were sequestered in hundreds of villages and prohibited from traveling. According to the June 2016 report of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, starting in 2012, the majority of Rohingyas, start quote, require official authorization to move between and often within townships in the northern Rakhine state. For example, a village departure certificate is required to stay overnight in another village. The procedure to secure travel are onerous and time-consuming. Failure to comply with requirements can result in arrest and prosecution. Restrictions routinely lead to extortion and harassment by law enforcement and public officials. Protracted displacement, overcrowding in camps, the lack of livelihoods, and constraints on all aspects of life exacerbate tensions and the risk of domestic violence. And just a little backstory, because he doesn't talk about it now because he already talked about it. The Rohingya is a Muslim population on the island of Myanmar, and the Myanmar population is largely Buddhist now. They do not acknowledge the existence of the Rohingya people or the Rohingya nation, who are already a displaced people group from a previous genocide. The nation of Myanmar actively says that population never existed, and it's one of the most devastating recent genocides outside of the Congo and what's going on in Sudan, or with the Uyghurs. I always mispronounce that. And it's also outside of the Armenian genocide that the Turkish people enacted also in the 1900s. So yeah, lots of things go on in the world outside of America, and somehow we're involved in all of it. So put your money where your mouth is. Okay, moving on. The treatment of the Rohingya minority in Myanmar robbed them of opportunities to work, and the constant harassment and policing no doubt created a mental health crisis among the population. All of this served to reinforce negative stereotypes of the Rohingya people, which served to legitimize the brutal and inhumane treatment of them that culminated in the 2017 ethnic cleansing of their population, as well as raising opposition to their acceptance as refugees in other lands. Frantz Fanon, a psychiatrist by training, was born in Martinique and lived in both France and North Africa. Fanon's 1952 Black Skin, White Masks, published when he was only 27, an amazing book, by the way, amazing, is one of the classic anti-colonial texts of the 20th century. In a description of how French police treat Algerians, Fanon concisely spells out how the regular practice of the colonizer, in this case, the French police in Algeria, can create the material conditions underlying a racist stereotype. The French stereotype of Arabs was that they were shifty, sneaky, dirty, and distrustful. But Fanon points out that this stereotype was created by the way that the French police regularly treated Arabs, and the fact that French rule impoverished them. Anyone would have a hunted, evasive look of distrust when they were subject to regularly being stopped by police in broad daylight for no reason. This is the only natural response to such treatment. The practice of French police itself caused colonial subjects to behave in a way that accorded with the stereotype. Summarizing the situation, Fanon concludes, it is the racist who creates the inferiorized. This was the whole understanding behind Martin Luther King's sit-in and peaceful movement, was that we cannot be these brutal apes that they constantly play us out to be. We have to show that it is the oppressor who is doing these things. So that's also what Jesus taught with turn the other cheek. It's the same concept, and it really is this radical shedding of understanding the cause that is outside of you. So yeah, I don't really know how to speak on that because it's not the 1960s, so the racism that I deal with every day, it doesn't get to be the violence that it once was, and that's a blessing. But now we're in a deeper gray area, and I just keep going back to Malcolm X quote. He said, if you stab me in the back with a knife 9 inches deep, and you pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it out all the way, that is still not progress. And I think about that a lot. And I don't know if answers are necessary in this time. I think something about America is we're too urgent for answers, and we don't allow enough time for the question to percolate. We don't give us enough time to sit in the uncomfort. I don't mean sit in injustice. I mean sit in the uncomfort of knowing that we as Americans have no idea what justice looks like because we come from a wildly unjust society and we are products of that. So every notion of peace and love and everything that we think we know, even at our most woke, is always going to be a little biased and polluted, which is why we need to travel, which is why we need to read and learn, just learn in general and humble ourselves. And also pause. So I really don't think we should be presenting answers. I think we should be listening to the Rohingya people, to the Sudanese people, to the Congolese people, to the indigenous chiefs and natives that are still here. We should listen and ask what their solutions are. I don't think we should be the ones providing answers as to what decolonization looks like. It doesn't matter if you're black, brown, or whatever. I'm not saying your perspective isn't valid. I'm just saying also acknowledge that you are likely, and I don't know what you are subjectively, but 90% likely you are complicit and culpable and a little more brainwashed than you think, which is not necessarily, it's not a dig, y'all. We can't get to where we're going if we don't acknowledge where we're at. We cannot keep gaslighting ourselves and each other just because of some ideals, right? The ideals are really great, but if we're lying about the data and the reality, we're not actually going to achieve that goal. We're never going to get to that ideal. We're just going to keep creating these superficial realities. Okay, I'm already getting off track. Moving on. The United States has its own history of policies that feed stereotypes and make them appear real. The structure of policing and incarceration and the white reaction to them is central to explaining how racialized mass incarceration in the United States constructs and seemingly legitimates negative group stereotypes. The chance of being incarcerated at least once in one's lifetime is 1 in 3 for Black American men, but it is 1 in 17 for white American men. But the tragedy of this statistic does not end with the incarcerated person's release from prison. Those who have experienced incarceration face dauntingly difficult job and housing prospects. A history of incarceration functions like a scarlet letter for employers. In a 2003 study demonstrating the devastating effects of prior incarceration on the search for employment, the Harvard University sociologist Deva Pager writes that incarceration becomes a label for individuals, much as college graduates or welfare recipient. This is the quote. The negative credential associated with a criminal record represents a unique mechanism of stratification. in that it is the state that certifies particular individuals in ways that qualify them for discrimination or social exclusion. End quote. In her landmark study, Pager discovered large effects of prior incarceration on employment opportunities. She used teams of auditors, 2 of whom were black and 2 of whom were white, with similar appearances and resume. Skip the page. With similar appearances and resumes. One member was told to report an 18-month incarceration for cocaine trafficking, and the other was told to report no criminal record. Each week, the team member who reported a criminal record would switch. Together, the teams applied for entry-level jobs in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Among whites, a criminal record reduced the likelihood of a callback interview for an entry-level job by 50%. Pager's white auditors who reported no criminal record had a 34% callback rate, and her white auditors who did report a criminal record had a 17% callback rate. The black auditors she used, with similar resumes, had a 14% callback rate when they did not report a criminal record. They didn't report it. So it's already lower than the percentage of white people with a criminal record. No criminal record as a black man, same entry-level job, 14% callback record. Suggesting that black Americans who report no criminal record already fare worse in seeking entry-level employment than white Americans who do report a criminal record. And only 5% of black applicants reporting a criminal record received callback interviews. According to Pager's study, both race and previous incarceration record have a drastic effect on one's employment chances. Adding race and previous incarceration record together makes employment prospects dramatically worse. Rising incarceration rates among black populations can naturally be expected to lead to rising unemployment among that population. And this study was in 2003, so it's definitely gotten worse. White American stereotypes of black Americans as lazy and violent derive from the very beginning of the United States, where these attributes were regularly used to justify the enslavement of America's black population. After slavery, these stereotypes were used to justify the equally brutal practice of convict leasing, which still happens today. Where do you think your license plates comes from? Who do you think puts out wildfires in all of those national forests? Prisoners. For cents. Cents a day. Okay. Moving on. Whereby large portions of the black population of the formerly antebellum South were arrested for petty crimes and leased to iron, steel, and coal companies for hard labor with fatal consequences. The mechanisms underlying the racialized mass incarceration of black Americans are part of a long tradition of justifying stereotypes of this population as lazy, that is, unable, being because supposedly unwilling to gain employment. In the 1960s, the Kennedy and Johnson administrations responded to the civil rights movement by pairing job training and anti-poverty programs with punitive anti-crime measures. When Richard Nixon ran for the office of president in 1968, he used urban unrest to change the subject from social justice to law and order, which is why I say fuck law and order, because y'all don't think it means what you think it means. He did so at a time of salient moments of urban unrest, but declining incarceration rates. Historian Elizabeth Hinton writes, quote, "When Richard Nixon took office in 1969, he inherited a penal system that had been shedding prisoners. The 1960s produced the single largest reduction in the population of federal and state prisons in the nation's history, with 16,500 fewer inmates in 1969 than in 1950. Despite this trend towards decarceration, under the auspices of the Nixon administration, the federal government began to construct prisons at unprecedented rates. We now have private prisons, so you can make a lot of money by throwing people away. Tax funded. No tax cuts. Oh yeah. in turning the nation's attention to law and order, the Nixon administration successfully made the case to drop Johnson's anti-poverty programs and job initiatives, focusing instead on punitive crime measures, and this is why we have the wildly militarized police that we do today. And they don't know anything other than drawing a gun. Okay. Especially in urban centers populated by African Americans. Hinton and others provide strong reasons to believe that Nixon and members of his administration were well aware that their policies were going to lead to dramatically increased incarceration among black citizens. There are disagreements and open questions in the now large body of literature on the causes of the current crisis in mass incarceration in the United States, but there is no disagreement that the combination of harsh punitive crime policies for black American communities, coupled with the drastic cuts to social welfare programs and job training, has led to tragic consequences and a self-reinforcing pattern of repeated stereotypes and policies. In addition to the clear link between incarceration and the inability to get jobs, the combination of severe cuts to the social safety net and job programs and punitive crime policies has led to a population of black Americans with stubbornly high unemployment rates. Pointing to this population, politicians employing fascist tactics, Trump, can speak of a crisis of laziness, supposedly underlying multi-generational poverty, rather than to its real causes. I also would like to point out that Kamala is a neo-fascist because she uses her color and her gender to perpetuate the same oppressive strategies of militarized police and a wildly unfair foreign aid policy and a disgusting military budget. So they're both fascists. Anyway, the laziness can then be supposedly cured by forcing this population into hard work, by further slashing that safety net. Given that the evidence suggests whites are not hiring black men, especially formerly incarcerated ones, this would then simply further entrench such patterns of unemployment, thereby perpetuating a flawed stereotype that is useful in fascist politics gaining power. In the 1970s, the effects of this combination of policies were unclear. It was possible to think that harshly punitive anti-crime measures were better than nothing to deal with persistent social problems such as violence and unemployment. But we now know that aggressive anti-crime measures targeted at minority populations paired with reduced social services to support those communities will lead to disastrous consequences. There have been years of media attention. There are years of data and experiments to the disaster of the policies emerging from the tough-on-crime movements of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, resulting in a large bipartisan support for shifting from punitive crime policies to social programs. However, what has not accompanied this shift is an awareness that the underlying motivations for the hard-on-crime rhetoric and policies, they were fascist. They were set up to establish an us versus them dichotomy and reinforce pre-existing hierarchical stereotypes. Acknowledge it. Speak on it. It should therefore concern U.S. citizens that at the time of this writing, the plan of many members of the ruling Republican Party in the United States, including the administration of current U.S. President Donald Trump, his Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, is to eliminate the already threadbare U.S. social welfare state while simultaneously making the criminal justice system substantially more punitive. He now has a criminal conviction. That didn't go anywhere. Let's talk about it. After years and years of media attention to the consequences of such policies, no one can claim ignorance of the effects of such a combination of policies, both on Black Americans and on white racial attitudes. It takes studious ignorance of the facts, what the University of Connecticut philosopher Lewis Gordon calls bad faith, to recommit to such failed policies. Such bad faith is, as we have seen it, characteristic of fascist regimes. We can see, in the case of U.S. politicians, attitudes toward crime policy and social welfare programs that this will for ignorance is not benign. It has an unstated purpose to create the conditions that allow racist stereotypes to flourish, so that politicians can continue to exploit fascist tactics for electoral gain. It's getting hot. It's getting hot in here, y'all. Let's crack a window. The air in. We're almost done, I swear. Actually, we might be done. Because the rest of this, I'm trying to remember if there was another point that I wanted to point out. I mean, this whole book is amazing. It goes on. Oh, that I really did love that part of the book. I want to keep reading because it's all amazing, but I'm like, I feel in the air that maybe I should hit pause, let you process, and you let me know if you want me to continue doing this, if this was useful. Yeah, I mean, I know you probably all have a lot of feelings and maybe are a little mind blown. Maybe this is not news to you at all and you're like, wow, I wasted all my time, and for that, I'm sorry. But yeah, let me know if this is something that was useful, if you have questions, if you want to talk about other topics. My newsletter, the third one, will be coming out within a week. And I have some art that I'm excited to share with you all. For the most part, I really just want to encourage you all to talk to your neighbors. Go to your local library. Learn how to urban garden. Pay attention to what ingredients you're eating. Learn how to cook. Follow other YouTubes that give digestible little tips and tricks. There's so many out there. Learn herbal remedies. Start drinking more water. Research solar power. And I'm not saying this to do out of fear. I'm saying this because we all have something to offer. We all have skills. We all have interests. And we all need each other. We need to tie our roots to each other because we all we got. We all we got. And at the end of the day, maintenance never stops, babe. It never stops. I love you all. Deep breaths. Slink out.